I guess without further ado, I'd like to introduce Catherine Canjo, the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego.
Thank you, Bailey. Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Catherine Canjo, the David C. Copley Director and CEO of the Museum of Contemporary Art. And our museum, along with this museum, the San Diego Museum of Art, has been hosting the annual Axline Lecture for 18 years. It's an opportunity for us together to invite a distinguished member of the art world to speak to our shared audience. We look forward to it, and we can do this because of the largesse of Rea and Jackie Axline. They were longtime trustees and supporters of both of our museums, and in 1999, they bequeathed a generous $35 million to each of our respective institutions, which provides us a level of fiscal stability and allows us to further our artistic programs. And so this shared annual lecture links our two museums through a program that emphasizes excellence. The Axline Lecture features cultural thinkers and scholars, such as former museum director Philippe de Montebello, or art historian Dr. John Richardson, as well as leading artists, such as Catherine Opie last year, Sebastian Salgado before that, Maya Lin. And to introduce this year's honoree, Nancy Lorenz, it's my pleasure to welcome Roxana Velasquez, the Maruja Baldwin director, to her very own museum here. Roxana.
Welcome, thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much for welcoming me to my museum. So thank you, Catherine. It's wonderful to have you all here tonight. This collaboration has allowed us to bring extraordinary art experiences to San Diego, and it's an opportunity to create new conversations and generate fresh perspectives. I'm thrilled to be here to start that dialogue by presenting this 18th annual Axline Lecture at the San Diego Museum of Art. As Catherine has said, and Catherine, I will repeat this, it's wonderful to be able to collaborate, to raise the bar, to raise the level of the quality of art and art experiences that we bring to our community, because this community deserves just the best. So thank you all for your support. I would also like to thank MCASD's president of the board and all the board of trustees for their support, Paul Jacobs, and of course the president of the board of the San Diego Museum of Art, Taffin Ray, joining us here tonight together with Jean Ray. Welcome, and the other board members. I've seen Robin there and Jill and Boskinard. Thank you so much for your support. Just as without the Axline gift, we couldn't make it without your support, so thank you. I extend my appreciation also to each one of the trustees and the members of this community that help us pursue our mission. I'm pleased now to introduce what promises to be a fascinating exploration of an artist's vision of combining opposing materials and creating at the same time a symphony of art. Nancy Lorenz. Nancy, it's my great pleasure to welcome you again to San Diego, and it is our privilege to have had the chance to, admire and observe the fascination that you have caused in our community and our audiences. Thank you, Nancy. And Nancy is an abstract artist who combines the distinctive contemporary Western practices with traditional Japanese techniques. Her work has been shown in many major museums and has been commissioned around the world, including the Beverly Hilton Hotel in LA, the Soho Grand Hotel in New York, and Chanel stores in Paris, Hong Kong, and Dubai. Nancy is also a frequent collaborator of the designer Peter Marino, having worked with him for clients including among many others, Bottega Veneto. Nancy earned a BFA in painting and printmaking at the University of Michigan and an MFA in painting from the Tyler School of Art, studying in Philadelphia, Rome, and Japan. And she is a 1998 recipient of the John Simon Guggenheim Award. Nancy is a New York-based artist celebrated for her sophisticated technique and radiant materials. She has said that the 5 years she spent in Japan as a teenager is her biggest influence. We're so excited to host her first solo museum exhibition, on view now at the San Diego Museum of Art, which includes works inspired by our own Japanese collections. The San Diego Union Tribune called her work a feast for the eyes, and Gallery Magazine designated the exhibition as a luminous retrospective that absolutely shines. Nancy, we are honored. We welcome you again to the San Diego Museum of Art, to the San Diego community. The mother of pearl inlay, the silver leaf to the gold pours your boxes, your East meets the West style, and your reinterpretations of all these forms are sublime and uniquely harmonious. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to applaud again Nancy Lorenz.
Check this. Am I on? Okay, good. Take this off. Great. Well, let me start by thanking. Sorry. Let me start by thanking Roxana. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank Bailey. Thank you so much for everything you've done. Everybody at the museum. It's just been the most amazing experience, and I'm so honored to be here tonight. So I'd like to get started with a visit to my studio. So here I am in front of my building. It's in Long Island City, New York, and I commute by bike. I take the bike over to on the ferry, and you'll see throughout the exhibition that water figures heavily into my work. But so my daily routine, I have a daily routine, sort of 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 every day, much like the ventilation equipment fabricators that inhabited the building before me. Here we have my roof, my skyline, New York skyline that I see, along with solar panels, and an interior view. Since everything is done by hand, and there's so many steps involved in the work, I have several assistants, fellow artists, who help me 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. Days I have the studio to myself, and that's my time to kind of make my plan for the week and do any large painting that really requires concentration and solitude. Here are a few drawing tables, and you'll see in the exhibition. I was so pleased that Ariel included so many drawings, which have never really been shown before. It's the heart of my work. It's my diary, really, and I rarely show them. So I was very pleased that Ariel included them in this exhibition. Bits of nature come into my work. Here you see my palette made of mussel shells from a trip to Maine many years ago. I still use that. Now, I make work that requires much time, and this collection of drawings transpired after a trip to Greece my daughter and I, on our last day in Paros, I just grabbed a bag of sand and brought it back in my suitcase. It was this sort of wet and not very attractive bunch of stones. But what I did throughout the months back in New York, I would pick a certain color sand or certain color stone and start my day with this meditation, laying the grid. And it was a wonderful recollection of my summer. Here you see how stones come into other work. Now, as Roxana mentioned in the introduction, my 5 years in Japan were extremely formative. My family moved there. We were there from 76 to 81. So I was 13 to 18. And it was really there that I decided to become an artist. More than anything else, it shaped my aesthetic. That bottom left picture was a visit to a temple sale. We would do, I would take trips on the Yamamoto line on my own and also with my family, just a weekend trip somewhere out and discover a new place. It was there that I would visit National Living Treasures, ceramic artists, and what I loved about being in Japan was that distinction between fine art and craft. There was really no boundary. Years later, after I graduated from University of Michigan, and then I earned my graduate degree at Tyler School of Art, I moved to New York in 1988. And I supported myself early on, restoring Asian antiques, and eventually I had my own business. So I learned these lacquer techniques on the job, really. And I would study the layers of chipped lacquer and really try to understand how the piece was built step by step. And eventually, these techniques started filtering in my own work. So here's an image of a screen I was restoring next to some early elements drawings from 1990. Here are my mother of pearl inlay supplies, which I get. They're super thin sheets. It's all cut by hand. And I get them from a supplier of musical instrument restoration materials. Here are my gilding supplies, burnishers on the left, gold leaf on the right. So along with Japan, my graduate year in Rome was very formative. And it was there I really fell in love with all things gold leaf. Another central part of my studio is this wall of small paintings. It's a library of sorts, and it represents about over 20 years of commissions and exhibitions. These smaller works are a way for me to work out the many steps involved in the larger pieces. Often in the case of a commissioned work, it's a way for me to start a dialogue with a client to find out what particular part of my work draws them. Here we have some elements. So much of my work begins with a curiosity about materials. This is Mercury from 1995. I often approach my day in the studio with an experiment and trying new combinations of materials, whether they be from antiques restoration or everyday materials found in a hardware store. And this sense of experimentation manifested in a project that I began in 1995, where I used the periodic table of elements. And it first began with this desire to create Mercury. I used my gilding experience from the furniture restoration and realized that I could make highly burnished silver leaf on drops of gesso look like beads of mercury. And this was the very beginning of all the poured work that you see throughout the exhibition. For example, This is gold pour on wood, black and silver on glass, red pour on cedar, I conducted these experiments with materials in the studio alongside with my furniture restoration business. And a designer named Bill Sofield saw that work and proposed that I do it on a much larger scale. This is for the David Barton Gym in New York. Bill is an internationally known designer, known for his work with Tom Ford, amongst many others. I love the idea of this large, fluid painting as a backdrop for weightlifters. And I've never been particularly precious about what venue I have my work in, as long as I love the client and I love the project. So Bill and David gave me free rein to do what I wanted, and it was a pleasure. So as Roxana mentioned, in 1998, I received a Guggenheim Grant, and my proposal was to make one drawing for each of the elements in the periodic table. So that grant really changed my life. I told my restoration clients that I was going to take 6 months off, and one project led to another, and I actually never went back to restoration. Here we have plutonium, sodium, so 20 years later, I decided to revisit the periodic table of elements, and here we have Mercury revisited. These elements, there were about 60 of these, of the 120, that were exhibited at Morgan Lehman Gallery in New York. That was in 2015. 120, well, I see you're checking. There's some that are still being invented, right? Yeah. Oh, how big are they? Oh, yeah. These are, this is 20 by 15 inches. So it's the size that you'll see this one in the exhibition. This is gold, silver. Here we have barium. So sometimes the element is less obvious, more of an association. And barium is highly reactive with air, and it creates the green in fireworks. So I interpreted it very loosely here. Carbon, made with coal and bits of glass to look like diamonds. Here's sodium revisited with Himalayan sea salt. Now, indium is more of a metal, but it's also a color. Of course, I'm attracted to the metals, but some elements are more ethereal. How to present the gases, for example. This is oxygen, and it's on super thin paper that moves and almost breathes when pinned to the wall. Studying the particular properties of each element pushed me in new directions. Here we have helium, glass beads on silk, rhodium. I particularly liked the way the jute, an everyday gardening material, created a grid for this piece. This is in the collection of Beth DeWoody. And it led to the large piece that you see in the exhibition above and below. Here I decided to keep that loose leaf on. And it sort of breathes the way the oxygen drawing does. I didn't really plan to leave the leaf on, but I just decided not to wipe it off, and I liked what it was doing. And in the studio, it was up against a window. And there's a lot more I want to do with this idea of transparency and casting shadows. So there'll be there'll be more of these, I'm sure, in the future. So now I'd like to go quickly through the process. Along with the gold that I saw in Rome, I was also very taken by the Arte Povera work that I had seen there. And here you see a very rough material. The next step was the aqua resin that was applied. It's a 2-part water-based resin. All the materials I use are non-toxic, and I think that's really important in my work. So here we have the gilder's clay. Here's the beginning of the gilding with the raised parts burnished. The gold is applied with water once the surface is completely refined. And a detail. So you can see in this painting how I've merged my interest in Sienese panel painting with the red clay and the gold, but also keeping an earthiness to the materials, as in the work that I had seen in the more contemporary Italian art. So the materials shape my work, but architects and designers with whom I work have collaborated with over the years also have very much shaped my work. So I'd like to take a moment and talk about that for a bit. And I first started creating whole room environments with designer Bill Sofield. The idea that one could be completely immersed in a painting was very exciting to me. And it could be a room, it could be a ceiling, a floor. So Whistler's Peacock Room was obviously a big inspiration to me, and his creation of both for his rooms, but also his luxurious use of gold. And he, of course, was also very influenced by Japanese woodblock printing. So this commission is from 1999, and I was able to live in this Laurel Canyon house for a week and make sketches in the room. My Japanese aesthetic was very well suited to the arts and crafts aesthetic of this house. Here's another view with the side. Beautiful. I love that tile fireplace. Now here's this lacquer and mother-of-pearl ceiling for the same house. And it was a kind of a constellation that hung over an octagonal table, with different parts of the ceiling becoming illuminated under the candlelight. The question of seams and joinery is always a problem with larger pieces, and Bill actually came up with the idea of using that kind of interesting seam through this large panel, kind of a reference to arts and crafts joinery. This was a more recent ceiling from 2015, also for Bill Sofield. And you'll note that it's the same wavy pattern that it runs throughout the exhibition in the museum display cases. Here we have another variation. This is a table I did for Michael Smith, and it's about 4 feet by 16 feet. It's a dining room table. It's white gold leaf and burnished with a resin that's flooded over the top. Michael Smith is a LA-based designer. Now, here's another very large table. One of my many projects with Bill Georges, a New York and La Jolla-based architect that I've been so lucky to work with over the last 20 years. He's a designer who freely mixes art and really amazing craft. And so we have a really lovely dialogue together. I always jump at the chance to work with him. He always has the most outrageous ideas. He came to my studio with this inspiration. This is a little 3-inch lacquered box. And he proposed doing this 6 foot by 12 feet dining room table. So I proposed that we make the chrysanthemums a little bit bigger, otherwise it was going to take forever. Here it's raised gesso. Each petal was laid by hand. And here you see a particular challenge was the pattern looks random, but the flowers had to match up, whether it was being used with 1 leaf or no leaves or 3 leaves. So that was my little puzzle to work out on this project. And here we have the other issue that had to be worked out was I had to make sure that there was no space too big that if you put a glass of wine down on one of the flowers, it wouldn't tip over. So the petals had to be close together. Here's a small sample which became a room for a private client of Peter Marino's. Mr. Marino has created many he's designed all the Chanel stores, Louis Vuitton, and many others. This is resin with moon gold. It's an epoxy resin. So this slide doesn't really show it, but it really looks like rain or water drops. So that little sample became this entryway for a client of Peter's. And this is from 2002. So being able to do these large commissions just allowed me to work on a scale that I would never otherwise have thought to do. This is an elevator vestibule. It's a private home in the Pierre in New York. So going back to 1996, here you're looking at one of my first commissions, elevator doors for the Soho Grand Hotel. And I've been so lucky to work with so many of these designers for 20 years. And I continue to work closely with Bill. So this project brings back memories. The 9 doors had already been installed in the hotel. And I was to do all my gilding on site. So I had to, in the morning, I would apply the oil size in this case. And then I would wait for a certain tack to achieve about 3 hours later and hope that nobody touched it. And then quickly apply my leaf sheet by sheet. These are, about 3 inches square. And then the pattern was laid at another occasion. So the challenge was there were about 300 workmen coming in and out of the doors, and I would have to do my work, and they were opening and closing. And there was a lot of dialogue involved, like, can't you just spray paint that on? So, but we did it, and they're still there. So Bill wants to revisit the elevator doors with me on a new project. He's designing for the Steinway building on 57th Street, but in bronze. I started with these experiments, which I'm very excited about, so stay tuned. I had never worked in bronze before, and so I began experimenting with various samples. And it's really thanks to Bill that I started working in bronze, and that led to some of the works that you see in the show, which will take new directions. So now I'd like to show you the rock garden room. At the time, I'd been doing many large private commissions that were not widely seen. So when Jay Grimm proposed me doing an exhibition in his tiny storefront in Chelsea, I said I wanted to just make this big room, and he happily agreed. And so those 4 panels that you see, it's arranged slightly differently in the exhibition. There was 4 panels on each side, but it completely filled the gallery. So you could see this sort of shining silvery garden from the street, and it really contrasted with the 10th Avenue and 29th Street in Chelsea. It began with sketches, very influenced by the rock gardens I had seen and loved in Japan. So yes, I wanted to create this fantasy garden, and it was later shown frequently in Paris with a designer named Shahan Manassian, who I still work with. It also led to other commissions. This was made specifically for clients who are proud contributors to the Central Park Conservancy. And so they wanted to figure out a way to bring the garden in somehow. And I worked with Peter Penoyer and Katie Lead on this project. Michael Smith loved the rock garden room, and he wanted it for private residence, but the panels didn't fit. So we proposed reconfiguring it somehow. And this is how the commission process often starts. I'll do a very low-tech, hand-drawn sketch. I know a lot of things are rendered on computer, but I've always done kind of a preferred the hand drawing. It's better. Here's the other version. Ultimately, what was created was something really similar to Rock Garden Room. I make all the work in the studio, but you can see how the panels fit around vents and doors and any fixtures. This was white gold instead of, which has a slightly warmer tone than the silver. It's not as silvery as the one you see in the exhibition. Here's another garden of sorts, and this is for a Beverly Hills client of the New York designer David Kleinberg, and this was done in 2012. It began with drawings based on Persian miniatures. And I'm sure many of you have seen the most amazing exhibition called Epic Tales, which is really extraordinary, and I look forward to spending a lot more time with that. But this was inspired by those only scaled up, all the branches. And here's a studio view of the panels. Silver leaf on raised gesso. Gardens and water have been an ongoing source of inspiration for me. And here's the silver water screen, one of the major works in the exhibition. I really love the idea that you can walk from one end to the other and different parts of the pearl become illuminated depending on where you stand. It's a much more physical interaction with the work. Japanese screens have always been a really big source of inspiration for me. And as you can see, I freely stole from this little drawing. It was actually an ink on silk detail that I had seen in a book, A Wave Under the Moon, and that's from 12th century China. Kind of an ancient Bridget Riley. Up close, you can see how the watercolor under the pearl adds a different kind of depth. This is in the collection. It's in a private collection, but at the moment I'm making continuing in the series, and I'm making one for the Fairmont Wuhan in China. And I love any chance I get to work in Asia. So I keep sketchbooks devoted to different themes, and this one's devoted to water, different water patterns. And these studies for water became a much larger commission for the lobby of the Beverly Hilton. And this was done in 2005. And it's one of the largest works I've ever made. It's 14 feet by 70 feet. And that came about thanks to Michael Smith as well. This shows different phases, the mother of pearl inlay, the raised gesso. This is the gold without any distressing or lacquer on top. Here we have, I'm revealing now a little known secret. I've hidden my kids' names in the wave patterns. And we have Adrian on the left and Lucy on the right. So it's very funny. I've gotten pictures of people taking selfies in front of, they have no idea that they're right there by the names. So here I am working on another commission. 2 large works for the Aquilina Hotel in Miami, more recent, that's 2015. There we have large pieces of agate inset as well. So I often have to stand on the work to apply lacquer and paint. What I really love is the sort of physical interaction with the work. And it becomes a bit of a dance, kind of a performance. There's so much precious craft involved in the work, but then there's this other side to the work that's very influenced by my years, also really appreciating abstract expressionism. When I studied at University of Michigan, it was abstract expressionism was definitely one of the big forces there. Again, one commission will lead to another. This is 18 feet by 20 feet, and it was commissioned by a family living in Mumbai. And they had been staying at the Beverly Hilton and thought that something similar would be perfect for their ballroom. Here in working with the client, we decided that rather than water, it should be more of a kind of a dreamy lotus garden. And here's one of the early drawings for it. I really enjoyed kind of working with these elements, and I decided to make special drawings. This is kind of collaged silk, and I could move the elements around and interact with the water patterns. It was made at around the same time as Silver Water Screen. So here we are, panels installed. There are actually 2 enormous doors that open. They installed it so beautifully, but behind that are these 2 doors that open up, and there are about 50 LED screen TVs. So when they have heads of state over to their ballroom, they can then open the doors up and have video performances. Yes, this is one of the largest homes. It is the largest private home ever built. It's 27 floors. And it's for one family, and each floor is 10,000 square feet. So it was quite an honor to be involved in that. And my work takes me to such interesting places. It goes much more interesting places than I do. But I'm really grateful for all the adventures. This sample brings back memories. It's my first sample I did for Chanel in 2000. And I've been really fortunate to have a really long working relationship with Peter Marino, who designs all of the Chanel stores. And I'm currently in the studio working on other things for him, including things for the 57th Street store and also the London store. So here we have Coco Chanel's apartment, which Mr. Marino wanted to reference. And my furniture restoration and having worked on Coromandel screens really gave me a great starting point to have a dialogue with him. And so we came up over the years
we've come up with all kinds of variations, and I of course, referenced the color, but then made them my own somehow. And he wanted something more contemporary. Here we have the Boston store, Chanel Costa Mesa. These are large panels. So what happens is they send me the panels, I do the work, and then their team reinstalls them. And I've done, at this point, probably over 40 or 45 stores worldwide. This is back to the camellias. These are raised gold and pearl inlay, and that is in Riyadh, an 8-panel screen. This one I love. This is moon gold, and it is for the Mall of the Emirates. I was actually thinking about this when I made the field painting in the exhibition, the kind of dreamy space for flowers. So now back to water. This is one of my favorite commissions. This is for the Cleveland Clinic Chapel, which I made recently. And it is horizontal. It's in this it's a meditation room / chapel. It's mother of pearl inlay and burnished silver leaf. This is a detail. So I love in these works that they, again, change depending on where you're sitting or how it's lit. So I've spent a lot of time discussing the commissions because not only do they keep the studio going financially, they also get me to do much larger work and push me in different directions that I wouldn't otherwise take. They allowed me to make work large and small for this exhibition. It's a group show called Beauty Reigns at the McNay Museum, curated by Renee Barlow. This is a large work in the show, Gold Sea and Cloud. And this brings us to Palladium Relief, which is featured in the exhibition as you enter. It was this work that Ariel Plotek first saw. And I was pleased that Ariel wanted to include the whole range of work, from the pearl inlay work to the more visceral raised silver on burlap. So when I first heard that I had the opportunity to have the exhibition at the museum, and I learned that it was not only we're going to have more space, but I was also going to have an extra year, thanks to Anita and Roxana, I decided it would be really interesting to spend some time with the stellar Asian collection in the museum. And I was particularly taken by this enchanting celestial wind goddess that hangs high in the Japanese galleries. So I started making sketches. I spent a week at the museum, and this was one of them, and again, very loose. Well, when I went back to my studio in New York, I kept thinking about that drawing, and I thought, I want to make that into a much larger painting. So I went back and forth with the image, and eventually I settled on placing it high on the panel. And I don't know if you can see clearly, but all of those lines are mother of pearl lines that I actually traced each charcoal line with pearl. And but eventually, it built up, and I ended up almost completely obscuring all that pearl work that I had laid. But and also there was it was much golder, had a lot more gold on it, and I ended up taking that out too. In the end, I wanted something much deeper and darker. And I guess I was thinking about how much I loved in Roman churches, the artwork would get covered with candle soot. And so I actually ended up putting black wax on top of the pearl and almost obscuring a lot of it. But I loved having this in the studio and loved how it looked under candlelight. And that's something I love to do, is have dinner parties at the studio and have the art around. It really looks beautiful in the candlelight. I was also really taken by these simple drawings on magazine paper in the museum's collection. This is by Sarazawa from 1970. And it's a small thing. It was a collection of 9 on one piece, and I found it by looking through the website, and we called it from the archives. And I kept copying this over and again, kind of like the practice of the sumi ink practice of repeating bamboo over and over again until it sort of became mine somehow. And drawing continues to be a daily practice. And if I have time when I go to museums, instead of taking my phone out, I'd much rather just do a quick sketch, even if it's not exactly accurate. And I find that taking the time to do this allows me to better see and understand the work and incorporate it. And for me, too, taking the time to do the watercolors is just one of the biggest luxuries. So during my week of drawing at the museum, I was also introduced to Rob Seidner, director of the Mingei Museum right next door. And he treated me and Bill Georges to a view of the many works in storage at that museum. And there I saw a screen by the same artist, Sarazawa. And here's another work I discovered in the San Diego Museum by the same artist. So I felt like there was this dialogue going on between both the museums, but also there was something I kept being taken by this artist. And so back in the studio, I began experiments with these Okinawa colors that I had learned about. And the drawings became this painting on silk. And I was so thrilled that the museum, they just kept doing more for the show. And I was thrilled that we were able to turn this into a special edition print. And that image was chosen, and along with the catalog. Both of these were designed by a longtime collaborator, Tomo Makiura. And these are her notes. We sent back and forth. She made very careful, precise notes that we sent back and forth to Benrito Atelier in Kyoto. And so there was a lot of FedExing that went back and forth, but we really wanted to get the colors just right. And the paper that was chosen in the end had a kind of it was a silk paper. So the print is extraordinarily close to the original. And I definitely am going to do more projects with Benrito because they were just so extraordinary. Here we have the document box, another work in the collection that I was really taken by. And it became one of the boxes in the exhibition. It began with sketches on site. And then here are 2 earlier versions that I did back in the studio, which I was not very pleased with. They just weren't quite what I wanted. So these were rejects. But then what I ended up with was this, where I really loved the contrast of the raw wood of the Polonia box with the very refined gold. And so these boxes I actually have commissioned. I have a source in Kyoto, and they custom make the boxes for me. They create boxes for tea ceremony implements. So the gold pours are a kind of letting go and letting the material do what it wants to do. And so I find that I'm always trying to find that balance between the super refined craft and then also letting the incidental happen. I've always made boxes, and starting with decoupaged boxes, cigar boxes when I was a kid. I do about probably 10 or 15 a year. And here are a few collaborations I've done with Thomas Meyer of Bottega Veneta. This is from 2002. He came to me. He'd been collecting my work, and he said, oh, I would love to do a special project. And so he suggested I make 15 of these lacquer paintings, and he would set them into his beautiful boxes. So this is in Tom Ford's collection. This is in Elton John's collection. And here we have a collection from the next year, Lunar Collection, and there were about 15 made that year. Skies and Beyond was the theme of this more recent collaboration. And this collection was exhibited at Salon de Mobile in Milan. And you'll see a continuation of these boxes in the exhibition here in San Diego. I loved working with Thomas. He totally respected my process, but he got me to do things that he kind of pushed me in directions that I might not have done. But this became the beginning of a series of many other works, actually. Here are a few from my collaboration with jewelry designer Temple St. Clair. She presented me with 9 of her gorgeous jewelry creations and wanted me to create a kind of a home for each one. And I love the idea that a box could be a kind of a home, like an inside-out room. Here's Sleeping Fox's home. This is one of my favorites. So as I was working on the chrysanthemum box for the exhibition, I also simultaneously started a much larger work. I love changing from the boxes to the larger works. And this was this raised, it was a field of raised gold flowers where I wanted the wood grain to show. I had been collecting pressed flowers from all my travels, so I started tracing those onto the panel. Here it starts. I'll go through the process really quickly. I really loved the way the wood grain of the cedar suggested a landscape, and it gave me something rougher to work with, to contrast. I distressed the grain with a wire brush, so you'll see in the painting it's raised and there are kind of hills and valleys. Here's the building up process. Flowers were added. Here we go. Over the years, I find myself finding every way I can make something take longer, to slow down the process instead of. So during the long winter months in my urban studio, I enjoyed creating this field of flowers, and it reminded me of my summer travels. I do get some relief from my urban studio. Here we have a picture of from this artist retreat that I go to every 2 years. I've been going there every 2 years since 2008. And it's called Kilrelig. It's on the southwest corner of Kerry in Ireland, a small stone cottage overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. And you arrive, and the key is actually under a stone by the door. It's really such a contrast to my life in New York. So Where my art making in New York is very layered and complicated with craft and process, when I arrive in Ireland, I just take one small suitcase, a little paper, and I try to keep my process really reduced. Drawing table lit by candlelight. And even during the summer, I keep a fire burning. And then during the day, I would take bits of the peat fire, the coal, and use it as charcoal for my drawings. And here you see the drawing that became Ivory Cloud for the exhibition. So Ivory Cloud is kind of a companion piece of sorts to Flying Apsaris, where Gold Flying Apsaris was sort of black and mysterious. I wanted to keep this one very ethereal and light. Here we have night sky screen. The night sky has been an ongoing theme throughout my work, and I go back and forth from the heavier physical materials to the more ethereal, as in the sky paintings. They're sort of a reference to the unknown, I think. Here we have another version of a night sky themed painting. In this case, it was a large commission I did for the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, the owner's suite. And this is more recent, from last year. It is 13 feet by 8 feet. And I was pleased that the Falcon's owner, Arthur Blank, wanted such a poetic painting. After presenting him with pictures of falcons and red and black, ultimately what he chose was this sample. So I was pleasantly surprised. Another simple drawing that came from my stone cottage in Kerry, Silver Sea and Sky. And here you see the beginnings of the blue painting that's in the exhibition. And I'll take you quickly through the process. This 7 by 10 foot painting began with a loose sketch, and then every watercolor line was traced and cut. Here's the clay, gilder's clay, very refined. And then I meticulously silver-leafed and burnished this piece. And I just wanted to show you how I start with one idea, and then sometimes it becomes something very different along the way. I decided I needed some indigo, and then it got darker and darker, and I really nearly obscured all that hard work I did by laying the leaf in silver and burnishing it. But I allowed the incidental to happen along the way. So also in Ireland, I brought along, well, I didn't have quite the right paper, so I started using this found cardboard. And then back in the studio, these Mountains for Flowers began, where I wanted to make cardboard landscapes. And here we have the beginning of the bronze pieces that you see in the exhibition, where the cardboard pieces are coated with wax. And I just loved learning about this ancient process. This takes place about an hour north of my studio at Salt's Fabrication. Here we have completed. So when I was in Japan, I learned to love ikebana. And it was really there that I first learned about it. And here I found my old ikebana notebook from 1977. I was not a great student, but I kept the book. And I'm including, too, this picture of the Hotel Okura, where we lived for 5 weeks. And it just was very eye-opening to me. I had we had been living in Texas, and I had never really seen anything remotely like Ikebana before. So that became very formative. And then years later, a few months ago, I invited Ikebana master Kan Asakura to my studio, just to see what magic he could do with his Ikebana mastery. And I let him just interact with the sculptures, and here are a few of his creations. Isn't that beautiful? I would, every 20 minutes, I would sort of peek over at what he had done. And I love what he did with this. It's kind of a gesture of bronze, and he magically suspended it with these irises. And I love that because it looks kind of like a Japanese screen. So along with the mountains for flowers, the cardboard experiments became these gilt works that you see in the exhibition. Here we have lemon gold sunlight with rain, and I wanted to show you how it begins with the cardboard, and very, very much shaped by some of those drawings that I'd come home from Ireland with. Now, the title that Ariel chose for the exhibition, Moon Gold, was in part based on this big painting that I had made. Unfortunately, it started cracking, and I am very meticulous about my craft, but the heat and dry conditions in my studio were causing all this gold to crack. So I actually had to remake the whole painting. And here was the second version, which in the end I'm much happier with. So to conclude, I feel that the Moon Gold Mountain and the screen and then the Palladium piece, it really sets up this whole dialogue between all the work, the parameters that I've sort of set out for myself. And they're all things I want to keep continuing to work with. That this trying to find this balance between meticulous craft, but also wanting to create something that transcends the craft. So, oops. Anyway, I have loved the opportunity to speak here tonight, and it's been such an amazing experience for me. And I just have become very impressed with this engaged San Diego community, and I hope you'll stick around and ask any questions, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you.